Now we're moving on to a second session, which is called Knowledge and Recognition. In this session, we're going to have a couple of presentations. There were 3 people listed originally to speak, but we've found from Elton Budd, who is a member of the South Seas community and currently runs the Australia South Sea Islander Research, originally from Tweed Heads. He's stuck in Sydney and been unable to get here, so unfortunately we won't be hearing from Elton. But in this session, we're going to explore the idea of a response, and through knowing and recognising the injustices that have been suffered by Australian South Sea Islanders, how does Queensland as a contemporary community respond? What does recognition mean and where might it lead us? We'll have question and answers to follow these presentations, but the first address will be from Clive Moore. Clive is one of the leading scholars of Australia and the Pacific. Clive and I went to James Cook University together as very young men. Clive's scholarship has seen him awarded the Cross of the Solomon Islands in 2005, and from 2006 to 2010 he was president of the peak body for Pacific Studies in Australia. But one of the early things that Clive did between 1974 and 1980, while a tutor and later a PhD student at James Cook University and the ANU, Clive and Patricia Mercer recorded 87 cassette tapes with 75 Australian South Sea Islanders at Mackay, Bowen, Eyre, Home Hill, Palm Island, Ingham and Hervey Bay. Some people were interviewed several times. Now, all of these tapes have been kept, and I think it's an extraordinary, valuable record. Clive, could I invite you to come and give us a short address?
Sean, how long have I got?
We've got about 20 to 25 minutes.
And Imelda's here somewhere, is she?
Yeah,
Okay. Okay. 20, 25 minutes, 2 pages of notes and many things to talk about. I suppose I should position myself in time and space. Sean has, in a sense, by saying we both began at James Cook University in 1970. I came from Mackay. My father was born in Walkerston, Scrubby, to anyone from that area. Not him, the town's called Scrubby. And they were a sugarcane labouring family, not a planter family. My mother came from elsewhere and they lived in Mackay. So that from young years, I went to school with South Sea Islanders and I was interested in history, and I was interested in the history of the sugar industry at Mackay and in Queensland. And I soon came to realise that you couldn't really understand the history of the sugar industry unless you understood the history of the labour force, and that was the Australian South Sea Islanders. So even though I did documentary research, I set out through a project which was funded from James Cook University. And look, we were young and naive really in our 20s when Trish Mercer and I both started doing these interviews. And we would travel on weekends to the various communities. I went back to Mackay because that's where my strength was, and I could stay there free with my parents. And we went to the Burdekin because that was easy access from Townsville. Trish went north up to Ingham. I never did any interviews up there. And I don't think we quite didn't know what we were doing, and we didn't quite know that in 2013 anyone would be valuing what we did. But it also created other materials as well. Matt Peacock, ABC journalist, did a program in, I think, 1978 called The Forgotten People, which was 3 one-hour radio programs. And the tapes from that, not only the programs, but the actual tapes from that, the raw tapes, were also rescued before the ABC threw them out and stored with the rest of the collection. And what we ended up with between about 1975 and 1981 was about 120 hours of tape. And it's fairly unique material because most of the people that were interviewed are now deceased. They're not with us anymore. There were a few people who were interviewed then who were young and were part of that recording material. But for the main, I mean, we interviewed people. The oldest person I interviewed was 99 years old. And, you never quite know what you're going to get out of an interview. She died about a week later. And she was not really interested in talking to us. Understandably, she was going to meet her maker. But what she wanted to do was play her mouth organ. And really what was important, but then musicologists have actually listened to this and been quite astounded. And I just thought, this is not a good interview, she just wants to play the mouth organ. But they are totally fascinated by it because her breathing technique apparently is a 19th century, it's not the way people play mouth organs today. She learnt, this was in 1970s, she learnt to play the mouth organ in about the 1880s. Something like that. And as I said, you never know quite what you're going to get. But some of the tapes are extremely long, some of them are sort of very free-ranging, some of them are looking at names and saying, this family, can you tell me the origins of this family and things like that. One of the important things that will come out of those tapes is the storage and the future use of them. We converted them in the 1990s from reel-to-reel little cassettes to CDs so that they're technically reasonably safe now because the tapes themselves are too frail to use. But one of the things that we want to do is work out ways to return them to the community and to put them into a form where they can be useful, and so that families can use them. We were always a little worried. There's some sensitive information on those tapes. There's people mightn't really like to find out their grandfather murdered somebody or something like that. There are some strange things on there, and no one's ever been able to use those tapes without asking permission. But we didn't have proper procedures back then in terms of permission sheets and the way people are interviewed today. They're much more, it's a much more controlled process. So we've trying to work out where they should be deposited and how they should be made more accessible for the community. There's a set at James Cook University. I have a set, and Trish Mercer has a set she only has an original cassette set, so there's only really 2 CD sets. But one of the things that we hope comes out of this interest in South Sea history, that we're able to secure a home for those tapes, because I really don't want to I don't want to be the custodian of those tapes. I'd rather an institution was the custodian of the tapes. So one thing that will be talked about possibly through today, and certainly in the conference which is being held in November, is the future for material like that. So that part of the response is returning that material. Now, in a wider sense than just the oral history side though, I'd like to try and put a little bit of a frame on the whole South Sea Island experience by giving you some sort of statistical rigour to what will be a very emotional experience, I think, today. So let me just be the historian and put it into a historical context, because it's a very complex process, and it started to be revealed through Joe and Rowena, because you get an immense complexity of family life over decades and decades. You're talking about 62,000 labour contracts, in a sense. So that as far as the Queensland Government is concerned, in their records, there were 62,000 records of individuals who they would say were contracted as indentured labourers. Now, you should be asking yourself, well, you might sign a contract today, perhaps you can read it and understand it, and you sort of can recognise the contract. If you're illiterate, you know nothing about literacy, you come from the islands like Katie, obviously in the records it would say she was on a contract. That's as far as the Queensland Government's concerned. But in fact, it's not a valid contract. But there are 62,000 of these individuals in the records. There weren't 62,000 though individuals. And my estimate, and it's a guesstimate as much as anything else, is that you're probably dealing with about 50,000 individuals. And we've already had mention of somebody who comes here from whatever circumstance, goes home and comes back again. Now, that person then shows in the records twice. So, and there are people, this was a movement of labour which went to Fiji as well as to Queensland, to Samoa and New Caledonia as well. So that there are people who went to all four. There are people who went to Fiji, went to Queensland twice, over a period of years. There was a group, for instance, at deportation time, who took up work in Fiji, so that they went from Queensland and CSR employed them in Fiji. And I've wondered whether Willie was actually one of those. About 400 or 500 of them who were, rather than go back to be sent back to their island, said, no, we'll go to Fiji. So that there is this complicated movement going on. There's 95% of them were males, 5% females. So it's a very male group. In law, again, let's go back to law, they should have been 16 years old. We know, and they're aged up to about 35 probably. We know that some of them are certainly under 16 years old. I mean, there's no way of knowing how old somebody is, but some of them do appear to have been 12 or 13 years old. There's no doubt there are some. How many in 62,000? I can't tell you, but there are some. Most of them would have been older adolescent males, probably 18, 19, set up to about age 30, something like that. There are very few people who are much older than that who came out. There may have been some, and certainly if they're moving over a 20-year period, well then they might be quite senior. And sometimes what happened was that the process is that a group might come out. We've got to talk also about kidnapping and about a long-term movement. But sometimes an older person might come out with 6 younger people. Sometimes you get one person who's obviously totally kidnapped illegal. So it's not a simple process. To give you some idea of the numbers from the various islands, I'll just read through the major islands and the numbers that actually came to Queensland. The largest number came from Malaita, which is 9,298. Most of those Malaitans came late on in the period. They're 1890s, 1900s. So that at the very end of the labour trade system, it's overwhelmingly Malaitans, about 1,000 a year are moving. But if we just go through the Vanuatu ones, Ipi, 5,084, Tanna, 4,244, Malakula, 2,934, Ombai, 3,658, Santo, 2,800, Afate, 2,690, Ambram, 3,450, Pentecost, 1,900, Other Solomon ones, Guadalcanal is about 4,000. Makeira or San Cristobal is about 1,000. Isabel is about 200. Savo Island, a small island, Savo, but 480. Nagala Group or Florida Group, around 2,000. That gives you an idea. But you're talking of 80 islands. About 80 islands. And those people spoke, if they came from 80 islands, they could have spoken about 200 different languages and dialects. On one island, you can have 6 or 12 languages. So that the complexity, and it explains why Pidgin English began to be used here, because the communications is a huge problem. That on plantations and farms, and then between themselves, they have to work out a way to be able to communicate, and it's Pidgin that develops and then comes from Queensland and is taken back into the islands out of Queensland. There was a question about kidnapping. In the early years, and largely what historians would say, that think of it as a moving frontier, if you can see what I mean, that different islands are exposed to labour trade recruiting at different times. The Loyalty Islands off New Caledonia in the 1860s, and in the early 1870s, after that, no, because it becomes a French territory and they no longer come. So anyone who's a Lifu or a Murray origin, you'll find that they're quite early. The Southern New Hebrides is also early in the 1860s, 1870s. There's no ships going into Solomon Islands until after 1871. So that for that first period, it's totally New Hebrides or Vanuatu and New Caledonia. Then this moving frontier goes north. They're searching for labour. And they're into the Solomons. In the 1870s, they go north up into the islands off New Guinea, into the Louisiade and Bismarck archipelagos. And that stops by decree of the Queensland government. Because two things happen. One, that you get, in 1884, Britain and Germany claim territory in New Guinea, so that it's no longer sort of an uncontrolled area in terms of European government. And the kidnapping rates and the death rates in Queensland are as high, in that very short period, from about 1882 to 1884, the death rates are horrifically high, and kidnapping is resumed, really, at a high rate. So that's blocked off, and then the rest of the labour trade, there's a movement back into the Solomons again and down into the New Hebrides. So if you can see this moving frontier going up the islands and then coming down the islands, and 870 voyages coming out of Queensland ports like this across the Coral Sea during 40 years, you can see how complex the whole process is. And how many were kidnapped, like Katie? Historians would say fairly confidently 10 or 15%. However, many of the islander families today will give you examples of their ancestors having been kidnapped. So that needs some historical explaining too, why there's such an overwhelming memory of it here, and why the records or historians think there was probably less. Largely what we believe happened was that in the first 10 years of this rolling frontier going into any area, you've got a high probability of force, deception, kidnapping. But as the process goes on, and remember that one island could have been accessed by Fiji and Queensland for 40 years, so that you actually have more than one generation moving. You've got the sons, and then you've got the fathers, and then their sons and nephews taking part in this whole process. So it changes over years, and we know that the records are actually very good onwards from 1892. The labour trade actually stopped between... in 1885, the Queensland government said, enough of this, cut it off, finish it. And that was Premier Griffith. And then by 1890-91, Queensland was in a depression, and economically the sugar industry would have failed. So they said, oh, well, big mistake there, let's go on again. And from that time, though, the governor, I think it was Governor Norman, said, okay, I want to know how many people have left their islands before? So there was a standard question that was always asked. Where else has this individual been? Have they been to Fiji? Have they been to Samoa, New Caledonia, Queensland before, etc.? And there's the records are good from 1892 onwards, and the number that were re-engaging and then for going through the experience for a second time somewhere in the Pacific is actually about a quarter from that period onwards. And that stays fairly stable at that. A couple of more general things. Several categories of people start to emerge during that 40 years. You've always got the first indenture labourers who've never left their island before. They come off their island for a period of work. They may then go back, or they may stay in Queensland. If they stay, if they go back to their islands and come back, they're called re-engaging. If they stay in Queensland, they're called time expired. That was the term that was used. So that one contract has expired, there's a second contractual obligation going on. And by about 1895, the time expireds were actually about 65% of the total numbers. So they were rolling over contract by contract. The other group, which is quite fascinating, are the ticket holders. And I think there's a little bit of a mention by Sean of these people, that in 1884, when they made some limits, they tried to stop the islanders working all over Queensland, which they had been. They'd been in the pastoral industry, they'd been in Torres Strait, they'd been in the sugar industry. They said, we want them as tropical agricultural people only. But the Parliament at that time actually said, hang on, you can't do that. That wasn't the rule when these people arrived. So they said, okay, from 1884, everybody has to work only in tropical agriculture, on the coast, in sugar, really. But anyone who'd been there for 5 years, they can do what they like. So that there's a group who were allowed to to work wherever they liked. There's quite large numbers. There were initially about 800 of them, and by deportation time there was still about 690. So that, and at deportation time they were allowed to stay. So that those that eventually stayed were, which are called the ticket holders, or really the very long-term time expired. And about the government allowed about 1,300 eventually to stay on humanitarian grounds and about 690 ticket holders to stay. So that's how you get the numbers that stay. And yes, as was mentioned here, a large number just went and hid in the bush. And certainly at Mackay, they went up into the back of the valley, up into, what would it be, Finch Hatton Gorge and areas like that, and lived there for a few years until all the fuss died down and then came down again. And the farmers did help them. The farmers hid them and helped them in that period. Now, Sean, am I coming close to the end of my time? 2 minutes, yeah. So, it's a picture of immense complexity if you deal with the history of Australian South Sea Islanders. We've been trying in the last couple of months to make accessible historical material. And that's something I think, I talked at the start about making the tapes from the 1970s more accessible. The other thing that I think it's important to do through the library system really is to make material available, either rewritten, because there's a huge literature on this. There's about 200 or 300 articles and chapters and books and things that have been written over time, but nobody really wants to read 200 books. So it's important that community have access to what materials exist, whether that be oral testimony materials or whether it be making written materials easily accessible. Because what is quite clear is that people need to know more about their ancestry and more about the history of their families and the general process, because some people are rather lost, I think, about their ancestry because their parents and their grandparents seem fairly uniformly to have chosen not to talk. It was a fairly difficult process that they knew they'd been involved in, and often they just didn't tell their kids. Now, their kids might be 70 years old today, but that information didn't get passed on. So I think it's important for everybody who can to help recreate community and pride in a community and a pride in survival under very, very difficult circumstances. Okay.
Thank you, Clive. Imelda is going to speak next, and then the three of us will sit here and throw it open for a few questions. But our next speaker is Imelda Davis. Imelda has 28 years' experience working in the film, television and radio industry as an editor for ABC News and Current Affairs, a production manager for the SBS series Blood Brothers, editing department coordinator. There's a whole series of things that she's done here, but I think we all know who Imelda Davis is, and so I will now invite you to speak.
Apologies for being so late. I've been panicking over this, so bear with me. But thank you for having us here today. Awa Teraba Lapan Lapan. My name is Wazakam Imelda Davis, and I am of Tanner Island heritage, born in Brisbane to Nellie Elizabeth Caius Nares. My grandfather, Moses Tupea Nares, was kidnapped off the beach at the age of 12 from Tanner Island in 1867 and brought to Australia, where he met my grandmother, Emily May Nares, and had 11 children. I'd like to acknowledge some people first and foremost. The traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, elders past and present. Our South Sea Islander forefathers and elders past and present. The Minister Ralph Regan-Varno, who is here today from Vanuatu Government, and to congratulate the State Library Queensland for delivering such a magnificent and diverse program this weekend in remembrance of this 150 years. I'd like to acknowledge the many South Sea Islander people in this room today, and those who are not present, who brought around the 1992 Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission call for recognition that saw the Commonwealth recognise Australian South Sea Islanders as a distinct ethnic group who value our heritage and contribution to the economic base of this country. I've hit the wrong button, sorry. Of this country. These people have laid the foundation of which we, as the interim national body, leverage today. I stand before you today as the President of the Australian South Sea Islanders Port Jackson Interim National Representative Body, nominated at One Talk 2012 in Bundaberg. We are based in Sydney, New South Wales. Our mandate is to deliver a national body structure at this year's One Talk 2013 to be held at the State Library Queensland on the 1st, 2nd and 3rd of November. I'd like to thank the State Library Queensland for their ongoing support and for providing at no charge $10,000 worth of resources for this year's conference. Some background information on our organisation is that we were established in 2010 by founding members, myself, my mother Nellie Nares, Carriot Pangus, Ni Togo, Auntie Shireen Malamu, who's here today. Mrs. Benita Mabo has recently accepted our request as patron, which is an honour to have such an eminent leader to take on this very important role. We value her support and look forward to working with her. She will assist in the very critical work ahead of drawing the public and Commonwealth and state government attention to many issues concerning the tragic history and abuses of South Sea Islanders. During the 19th and 20th century. What our team has achieved to date is no small task and considerably hard work. I would like to congratulate and thank the ASSI PJ team for their ongoing unpaid and commitment to the work needed, in particular Auntie Shireen Malamu and my mother Nellie Inez and Danny Togo, who give me the courage and support needed to take on this challenge. Also Matt Pole, Ni Wadigo, who is no longer with us from the early days, and more recently Professor Clive Moore and Murray Geisler, who have mentored and developed so many strategies with us in getting government to take notice of our milestones of success in seeing this year 3 capacity building workshops funded under Senator Kate Lundy's Community Cohesion Program to the value of $50,000. And a further 2 capacity building workshops to be delivered through the Pacific through philanthropic funding in the Solomons and Vanuatu at 4 days per location to the value of $30,000. All ASSI PJ team members bring a strong and required skill base to this vision. Our organisational structure consists of Australian South Sea Islander Representative Board, myself as President, Danny Togo as Vice President, Shireen Malamu and Melina Fakatava, Ni Togo, and Shola Diop. Our strategy team is led by Paramount Chief Dwayne Vickery, who's originally from Mackay, but is based now in Tasmania. Chief Vickery will be responsible for the facilitation and explanation of all national body structure, of a national body structure that will be presented in November. Other contributors to the development are Graham Tanner from Bundaberg, Badassi, Pastor Ray Minnicon from Bundaberg, who's based in Sydney, and Murray Geisler. Our historical advisory panel is led by Professor Clive Moore and Professor Graceland Smallwood. Professor Clive Moore is from University of Queensland, and Graceland Smallwood is from JCU University in Townsville. Also, Dr. Francis Babongi from Central Queensland University, Professor Doug Hunt, James Cook University, Cairns, and Professor Steve McMullen from Central Queensland University. The One Talk Working Committee, who put their hands up at Bundaberg 2012, representatives that will be responsible for feedback and development on our national body structure, come from Australian South Sea Islander associations and community groups across Australia. They are Matthew Sheaf from Brisbane, Mariana Obed from Vanuatu, Dennis Babongi from Queensland, Jody and Fiona Mount from Tweed South Sea Island Association, Chief Simon Kakar, wrong pronunciation, Vanuatu Indigenous Descendants Association, Kakai Pakoa from Vassic, Matt Nagus from Bundaberg and District Association, Don Fukwandi from Sunshine Coast, Robert Mann and Loris Corowa from Linking the Generations Rockhampton, and Marcia Eves from Mackay. The ASSI PJ has been an effective lobby group that has seized opportunities for meaningful dialogue with state and Commonwealth governments, as well as educating these agencies and broader community on the history of Australian South Sea Islanders. 2012 saw minimum funding in support of One Talk 2012 from the New South Wales Minister for Communities and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Affairs, who donated $5,000, Minister Victor Dominello. Also, Bundaberg and Regional Council funded One Talk $3,900. This conference was delivered in partnership with Badassi Group, who did a terrific job in resourcing additional support on the ground to support our delivery. The Vanuatu contingent was a highlight at One Talk 2012, with over 40 delegates in attendance from the government and families and community participants. This year, we anticipate an even larger attendance, given the amount of awareness that has occurred over the last 12 months. More recently, we have scheduled a panel discussion in partnership with the Sydney University Law Faculty, the Sydney Ideas team, for the 20th of August, which will see further discussion around recognition with panellists representing from Queensland and New South Wales, such as Paula Vitti from Rockhampton, who will speak on her perspective of dual citizenship, Professor Clive Moore, an historical recount, Jeff McMullen, the former journalist for 60 Minutes, and he'll do a summary on ASSI affairs, Shireen Malamu, her perspective on slavery, Professor Graceland Smallwood will bring an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander South Sea Island perspective. The debate and many debates to be had will inform the further development and delivery of meaningful programs and services for our community. On the 15th of August in New South Wales Parliament, the motion for recognition debate was presented by Independent Minister for Parliament Alex Greenwich. This debate saw 7 ministers or MPs speak in acknowledgement of Australian South Sea Islander history and the atrocities that occurred. The vote for New South Wales recognition for Australian South Sea Islanders was unanimous on both sides of the House. The New South Wales Premier Barry O'Farrell requested, in follow-up, we meet next week with the Minister of Communities to commence a dialogue on the development of a New South Wales action plan for New South Wales. At this point, I'd like to encourage the community to consider a national voice, representation and discussion that you can bring to One Talk 2013, as we hope to elect delegates on a national representative board, and in doing this, discuss the selection criteria that comes with the terms of skill base and administration of such a body. Thank you too much.
I'd now invite Clive and Imelda to take seats at the front here, and there'll be a brief interruption while I move microphones. One, two. Right, sorry. For those who might not have been there last night, Clive spoke briefly at the end of our session last night about a meeting that the group had with the Foreign Minister, Senator Bob Carr. So I might just ask you, if you could, to tell us about that.
So I'll repeat what I said last night because it's been niggling at me for a long time since we had the meeting. I always had a good impression of Bob Carr, I must admit. I don't anymore. And it's important, I mean, he's at present the Foreign Minister, and this is an issue which is domestic to Australia, but it's also a foreign policy issue because it's a very complex mix of Australian South Sea Islanders and misdeeds by Queensland and Australia in the past, which involve mainly Vanuatu and the Solomon Islands, but also Papua New Guinea, also Fiji, also Tuvalu, also Kiribati. There's a lot of Pacific nations that are actually involved in what happened with the whole kidnapping process, the deportation process, which was an Australian government process. I was privileged to be able to go with Imelda and Shireen and Danny to see Bob Carr, and he invited them. They saw him at a function,
Yes.
explained who they were, and he said, "Oh, do come and see me in my Sydney office," and they did. And he had briefing notes. We made certain of that, and his minders obviously knew what was going on. But when they got to the door, he sort of shook hands and said, "And what island are you from?" And Danny sort of took a bit of a start, and he didn't say the island of Tweed Heads, but gave his island origins. And Imelda said Tanner, etc. He had no idea that they were actually Australians. Then we came in, and I hadn't read his briefing for certain, and I've always seen Carr as a historian. That's what he claims, that he understands these things. So I thought, this will be easy. He knew nothing about Australian South Sea Islanders. He remembered a school book when he was at school, and there was a photo of a South Sea Islander in it. I said, yes, Minister. And then he'd never heard of deportation, which astounded me. And then he gave them a full 15 minutes and ushered them out the door. And he basically sort of said, oh, well, this is a domestic matter, goodbye.
With the promise of a second meeting.
With the promise of a second meeting. Shireen presented him with one of her very valuable paintings, which she'd now like to ask back again. But he promised a second meeting that never came, and then he set up a meeting with one of his advisors in his Canberra office when we were there. And I've never seen such... if Carr's performance was bad, so his advisor was worse, because he really didn't want to be there. He'd been told to shut down and not say anything at all. Yeah. And he was quite condescending. And certainly when we said, well, this could be brought up in the forum, in the Pacific Forum, or through the Melanesian Spearhead Group, because it's something which hurts not only Australians but these people out in the islands. He said, oh, no, that'll never happen. You know, I know all about the forum. Don't waste your time. Sorry? Yeah. So, I mean, we came out of that quite disappointed and dejected.
Yes, we did. But that doesn't stop us. We'll just keep knocking on the door. And quite frankly, I'm going back with a stern letter about the promise that he made us and request of return of Auntie Shireen's painting. That might get his attention.
The current Parliamentary Secretary for Pacific Islands Affairs is Matt Thistlethwaite, who's rather tied up at the moment trying to win Peter Garrett's old seat, so he's moving from the Senate to the lower house. But I had a meeting with him in Melbourne just after he was appointed. Richard Miles, who had preceded him, I think did a pretty good job, really travelling around the Pacific a lot. So I went to see Matt Thistlethwaite, and I told him about this week and how important I thought it was, and also the fact that his main interest is really in multicultural ethnic immigrant groups in Australia, and I thought that this would have some real resonance with him, the fact that the South Sea Islanders were having this week or month of remembrance of 150 years. But I didn't get much reaction at all from him.
No, either did we. We met with Matt Thistlethwaite, and it was more of the same. They're not aware of the history and very blasé about any commitment or follow-through, sort of passing the buck continuously.
Sean, the other group who have been conspicuously quiet are the Government of Queensland. Because we went to see Minister Elms,
yes,
who gave a decent hearing, but certainly didn't open his wallet in terms of giving assistance to the November conference.
Well, that's right, and he wrote back, despite the fact that I received a request to submit an application for funding, and despite the fact that we're delivering our programs and services in Queensland, receiving a letter saying that we didn't meet the selection criteria.
And the other thing which, the part that I've really played in the last couple of days is raising what I believe is a very important issue, and that's what's called the Pacific Islanders Fund. And, you know, I can see if I can summarise it in 30 seconds or a minute, but various monies were collected by the government and placed into a Pacific Islanders Fund which was held in the Treasury. Some of the monies that went in there were the wages of all deceased Pacific Islanders from 1885 to 1905. And you must realise that 15,000 Pacific Islanders died. Some of them died earlier than 1885. It's a large number. So that all of their wages were taken by the government, put into a fund, and the idea was in the Act of Parliament, 1885, where it was set up, was that money was to return to their next of kin in the islands. Not as cash, but as goods. It should have been taken back on the labour trade ships by government agents. It wasn't, well in fact it was, only 85% of it was kept by the Queensland Government. They didn't return the wages of deceased islanders. And they used the money to finance the whole administrative system and also to help the Commonwealth pay for deportation in the end. Now, I've added that up as well as I can, and it's difficult to work out an exact amount, but it's at least £35,000. Depends how you add it up. It could be, you could say it was as high as misappropriation of getting closer to £100,000, which today you take £1,000 with inflation and compound interest because it's money that the government would have had to borrow in some other way, and 1,000 turns into $1 million. You're talking of at least $30 million today, if not $100 million, $40 million. I'm being conservative when I'm saying 30, 40. The Queensland Government, therefore, stands accused in the 19th century of misappropriating something that is at least today worth 40 million Australian dollars out of the wages of Pacific Islanders. It's very similar to the stolen Aboriginal wages situation. Very, very similar. They stand accused by me and by others, very publicly, and yet there has not been one word in reaction from them. How low can they keep their heads? There's obviously something quite clear planned in the Queensland Government at the moment, and that is no comment. And they're hoping this will go away. It won't go away, because this 150th anniversary is an important time for South Sea Islanders to proudly say, we're here. We're still here. You tried to get rid of us. You tried to deport the lot of us. We're now a community of possibly 30,000, 40,000 people. And we have become politically active and together enough to be able to present our case and sort of say, governments, this is what occurred. You deal with the issue in the same ways you've dealt with Aboriginal issues. Have the guts to do it. The Queensland Government, the Newman Government, has been extremely quiet over this. I'd like to hear from a representative of this Queensland Government.
We've got someone with their hand up there. Could we...
Certainly don't want to offend anyone. But is it time, if we want to move forward as a group, is it time that we stop looking at those sorts of issues, those economic issues, particularly in the context of the Queensland Government today, where for whatever reason it's trying to save multiple millions of dollars. I work in the health sector, and you know, it's drawn millions, about $120 million out of the health sector. Is there overriding concern, do you think, the fact that they might have this compensation and this ongoing legal issues? And is there a time as a people to draw the line and say, that happened then, we don't want any compensation for that, we just want recognition that it actually happened? Because by and large, it hasn't happened to the people in the room. So is that something that we should think about, you should think about as a group?
Clive has actually got some suggestions on... He's not talking about compensation.
No, we're not talking about exact compensation for any family. That's not really... I think that's most unlikely to occur. It is fraudulent behaviour. Fraud is fraud whenever it occurs. But the compensation can be very multi-focused in that the Queensland Government did set up, after the BT Government's recognition, a South Sea Island Foundation, which has done good things. It's actually something like $900,000 have gone in scholarships and in cultural things for South Sea Islanders. But the Commonwealth Government moves in the 1990s have faltered. For the best intentions, they did things for a couple of years and then said, oh, well, forget about that. There needs to be a foundation, I believe, set up by both the Commonwealth and Queensland that does more to assist South Sea Islanders in it's probably Imelda which can talk about this in terms of sort of building the capacity of their community. But this is wider than this, because if you listen to Ralph Regenvanu from Vanuatu, for instance, Ralph said part of this compensation can be making the seasonal worker system work properly from Vanuatu in the Solomons. It's been a total failure. This is not direct compensation, but it would bring Solomon Islanders and Vanuatu people into Australia to work. They would mix and meet with their Wontoks, and they would take money home to develop their own areas. Imelda.
And may I just say, with all due respect, and that was the past has a domino effect on what's happening today in terms of, you know, the ongoing disadvantage that we face as a community. Yeah, I mean, we're all here living and breathing and surviving, but there are severely disadvantaged community groups out there in the South Sea Island and in Vanuatu in the Pacific. We need to rebuild those ties and reconnect with our family, culture and heritage. So those funds are relevant in the fact that we need it to capacity build within our communities and setting up bilateral relationships with our families in the Pacific.
One of the things that Ralph Regenvanu, the lands minister in the Solomons, in Vanuatu, said last night was this need for unity of the South Sea Islanders in Australia.
That's right. Government will not listen unless you have a united voice. We need to come together, put our differences aside and move forward collectively. Otherwise we're just fighting, you know, a battle that's not going to suffice anything. I mean, you've got Canberra, you've got the government, they speak on behalf of all Australians. We need to do the same thing.
There was a question just here, I think.
Hi, I'm just wondering who from the Education Department is invited to this conference. The Queensland State Education Department, the curriculum branch, because most Queenslanders don't know any of the history of the South Sea Islands, despite the fact that it is a significant part of Queensland's history. I think it needs to be taught in our schools. It needs to be part of the essential teaching on the history of Queensland. It isn't, just like Indigenous Australian history isn't. It's not just about top-tier tertiary education and, you know, media and politics. We also have to get to the education system so that people actually know who we're talking about. I've spoken to many people that feel offended because they don't know, but they close down because they don't know when they should know. So we really, you know, were people from the Education Department invited to this conference that are in the primary and secondary sector? And is there anyone here? And if not, why not? And why not? Why isn't education a part of this debate?
Olivia.
Hi everyone, I'm Olivia Robinson. I work in the State Library. Joan, that's an interesting question. We obviously sent lots of invitations out. Last week I actually gave a session, what they call a one-channel session, to teachers in Education Queensland, explaining what the weekend was about, explaining you know, an overview of the history and what resources are out there for teachers to use in teaching the new history curriculum. And really just try to give them a bit, open their eyes a little bit to the history. Unfortunately, I didn't get a good response. I got about 2 people, which was excellent, who logged in from throughout the state. And they recorded the session, and it's now up on One Channel, which is the internal internet sort of learning device for Education Queensland. And so that'll be up for the next 12 months, and we'd certainly be encouraging people to, and teachers to access that. But there is a bit of work to do. I mean, we find just generally there's a lot of work that we need to do in terms of advocacy for Queensland history generally within the teaching of the curriculum, the history curriculum, but also, you know, certainly raising the profile about Australian South Sea Islanders and what resources are out there in places like the State Library, the Queensland Museum and the Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art, that people can use as part of their teaching.
Can I answer that quickly too?
Yes.
If I can just answer very quickly about curriculum, and you know, in relation to the questioner at the back saying, well, you know, what is expected from this, part of it could be just raising awareness in the education system. I think many people would be very interested to know more about South Sea Islanders. Now, there are two things. One, in the national history curriculum, at the grade 9 level, they've now included Australian South Sea Islanders as a unit in there. So that in that national curriculum there will be a constant need for material and knowledge about South Sea Islanders. And there was some very good curriculum material done in about 1996, I think, by Education Queensland, paid for by AusAid, I think, and workshop with the Islander community, so there was very much an involved process. That material really fell like a stone and disappeared. I don't know, they produced a couple of thousand copies for primary and secondary. I don't know if they're still in the school system. That was really pre-digital age too. These days those materials could be revived, put up on the net, updated a little and used very satisfactorily.
Actually, that's what I was going to say. That's what I was going to say, Clive. Those things were produced and they were being used in Mackay for at least a few years after they were developed. But that's a complete curriculum for, I think, primary and secondary school. I think it was produced with at the same time as Queensland recognition. Just immediately after that, it was one of the things the Queensland government undertook.
It was about 1996-7.
Just before, was it? Yeah.
It comes out. It was federal money, and it came after the federal recognition.
But the fact is that it's been done. It's silly to go and do it
Yeah,
all over
and
again. Maybe update.
it's a resource which is no longer totally current. It needs updating, but it should be revived. And if that went into the school system, it would actually be a very valuable resource.
It's more than just...
Sorry, we've got another question at the back, sorry.
Sorry, I just wanted to introduce myself, Fiona from Tweed, and just to mention I am a teacher in the Queensland state system. The way Queensland is structured, we have the national curriculum at the moment, which is done by ACARA, and from what I understand, speaking to friends in other states, Queensland is the laughing stock at the moment, education-wise, throughout Australia. Last year we had new curriculums thrown onto us for English, Maths, Science. This year we've got English, Maths, Science, History, and we are just getting, it's like baptism by fire to take on these curriculums, whereas New South Wales is actually building up their teachers. They're only taking on English, and they're doing PD for a year before they do even take on English. But with regard to the history, I have grade 6 at the moment. We are studying multicultural societies that came here. My suggestion was 150 years, South Sea Island culture, let's do it. I can do the whole thing. But I was told, no, we need to go with the curriculum, which is the Vietnamese boat people coming out in the 70s and 80s. Then the children have to choose their own curriculum or their own culture to do a different study on. I was told once again, no, we want them to study Italians, Greeks and Germans. Okay, well, that's fine, I'll do that as well. But when you're up against the restrictions a teacher is up against, sometimes it's the easy way out to take the national curriculum and just go with that when the load is so heavy. Personally, I don't like the easy way out, so I do go the hard way. Every class I've ever had has always been told and taught about the South Sea Islanders that come into Queensland. But that's only one teacher, one group of 28 kids, who then go home and share it with their parents. So the ripple effect I'm having, as far as I'm concerned, is probably good, but it's not good statewide. And we have other teachers saying, no, I'm not teaching it because I don't know and I'm not aware of what that history is and I don't know how to teach it with cultural sensitivity. Clive is right, in grade 9 they do teach South Sea Island history. However, my niece who's in grade 10 this year was in grade 9 last year. Her history teacher said, here's your assignment, and this is on the Gold Coast, here's your assignment, you've got to do either the Chinese Gold Rush or South Sea Islanders. My suggestion is do the Chinese Gold Rush, so much more information out there. I do thank the Lord above for my niece. She's got a steel backbone. with a soft cover. And she said, no, I will choose South Sea Island, thank you very much. That's my heritage and you need to know about it. I will teach you. So she's actually done something, and it's one little thing, but if one little person stands up and says, no, I'll teach you about it, I'll make sure I go against the grain but still follow what I've got to do, we'll get somewhere.
Thank you very much.
And sorry. And may I just say, and thank you, Fiona, for sharing that. This is where a national body comes in to ensure that these things are mandatory, and we have to take a blanket approach to how we deal with government. Otherwise, we're not going to get anywhere, and it'll be individuals who are doing great work in their communities, which we applaud, but we need a united voice.
I'm afraid we're running out of time. Was there one last?
Yeah, I just
question?
wanted to say that there has to be a united voice, but there also has to be strategic political, onslaught to actually achieve this. And I'm wondering what this weekend can give to the creating of a national body or whatever, because I'm very confused about all these different groups. But, we can talk, but we need strategic action. And is there something going to come out of this weekend?
I think the common dialogue that I've come up against this weekend is more of the same, the lack of education services and programs for our communities. And that's something that's been unearthed as a part of the Human Rights and Equal Opportunities report as well. So it's about the follow-through on those 6 recommendations and looking at the current demographic and needs of the community today. So the conversations are very healthy to have weekends such as this in leading into One Talk 2012, where we'll present a model of a national body and we will discuss the election of delegates that will take this vision forward. But, we've just got to keep having this open dialogue, which is very healthy. And, the penny or the dust will settle. And I'm sure One Talk will deliver that.
And I think that November meeting should have recommendations coming out of it on things like curriculum.
That's right. And may I just say, in the lead up to One Talk, we'll be delivering a workshop in Mackay as a part of the 50,000 that was funded. We're delivering 3 capacity building workshops. So one is Mackay and the other is Tweed Heads at the end of beginning of December. But those findings also will take One Talk 2012 into Mackay, sharing with those community groups that couldn't attend, getting feedback from that. We've got to take a grassroots perspective to the development and representation of this national body.
Thank you, Imelda. Look, I'm afraid we've run out of time. Could you thank our 2 speakers?